but I may have to read a couple of things from the slides so that the interpreters can do their job. Okay, so many of you are new to the TUED conversation, which I'm going to just give a quick overview of what TUED work has looked like, and then transition into the thinking that has been done on the public pathway with its strengths and its weaknesses. So I want to emphasize that point, that the public pathway framework is a work in progress. It's not a fixed formula. Of course, there are national variations, but what we see with the neoliberal model is they didn't care too much about national variations when they developed the policy. It was a one-size-fits-all policy. And so even though we acknowledge the diversity of the countries and their energy systems, there is a common framework that was put forward by the neoliberal order, and now we need a common framework to respond to that. Now, we call the public pathway a theory from here to there. It's trying to address weaknesses in our own movement. The weaknesses being that the idea of a massive societal transformation is often asserted in the language of principles. We need to have a different world. We all agree with that. The question, though, is how do we get from here to there, and what is the role of energy, and how do we reorganize energy in ways that can address the climate crisis and other crises? It's not just a question of climate. Next slide, please, Lau. Thank you. So, apologies for my boomer visual here, which... So, I'm not a public pathway expert, but I do know that any analysis and proposals we come up with must have a full understanding of existing energy policy, because we need to know where it's failing, and it is failing. We also need... Seems like there's more than one failure going on at the same time. Then we need to know what's the imperative, the scientific imperative, and climate science is number one in that respect. Number one in that respect. And of course, anybody who's talking about climate and energy policy immediately gets plunged into finance and investment policy. So with that in mind, I would urge us all to be nerdy for the next 20 minutes or so and think about these things. Now, I want to go back to I want to spend a few minutes talking about the neoliberal model of energy transition. And of course, we've spent 10 years writing about this. And I think our analysis, even though it was primitive in the beginning, in 2012, it's actually grown a lot stronger. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But what we know is there was the Paris Agreement in 2015. That succeeded the Kyoto Protocol, and we had the world committed to a very aggressive decarbonization agenda. We also know that there was a narrative. That narrative is falling apart as we speak, and we're going to address that in one of the sessions this afternoon. And that narrative is that the transition was inevitable. Now think about that for a moment. This isn't the only person. This is Ban Ki-moon, former Director General, I think, of the United Nations. This has been the dominant narrative, that climate protection was going to be a big money-making opportunity for corporations. That was the narrative. And out of that narrative grew something called green growth. You've probably all heard it, but underlying green growth was this idea that we can continue to have capitalist expansion, but as long as it became progressively greener, one day, someday in the future, there would be a decoupling of emissions from growth. In other words, we can carry on growing forever, and then the emissions will come down, and that was called the theory of ecological modernization. But green growth is good enough for our purposes today. We also saw that the emissions levels have been rising every year, with one or two exceptions, recessions, COVID-19, emissions continue to rise. And what has also risen is the ambition of governments to reach very aggressive climate targets. But we need to draw a distinction between a press release and an actual plan of action. Because anybody can say, oh, we'll be net zero by 2060, I'll be dead and gone, that kind of thing. And of course, without be reaching the net zero emissions. I don't have time to explain what net zero is, but it's pretty easy to figure it out. Now, one of the problems the neoliberal system confronts now, and it was aware of a decade ago, is that there was just not enough investment, particularly in the global south, to reach climate targets and sustainable development goals. And so they came up with an idea called de-risking, or the blended finance approach. This is the World Bank document, From Billions to Trillions, and it said, in order to reach net zero and other climate targets, the private sector must invest, because the public governments do not have enough money to invest. And therefore, to get the private sector to invest, governments should put money on the table to make profitable what would not otherwise be profitable. So this is a very big conceptual change from the original green growth theory, which was anybody who got involved with climate protection would have a competitive advantage over their rivals. In other words, because you did climate protection, you would be more efficient, you would use less energy, and so on. So that was the basic argument. By 2015, it was clear that it wasn't happening, that in the global north, more and more subsidies for private renewable energy and other green economy companies was being put on the table. But the south didn't have that opportunity to subsidize new markets into existence. Now, let's turn to the labor movement. Sorry, this is a bad image of a union leader on the ropes, struggling. So I want to talk a little bit about the trade union narrative. This isn't a union leader, it's a boxer, but anyway. This wasn't a good idea, was it? No. So anyway, so remember, we're talking at a time when the trade union movement has gone through a history, or rather decades, of retreat. And one response to that retreat was to get closer to employers and say that we support green growth. We believe there are jobs, we believe in a just transition, and we believe in social dialogue. And that's not an innocent term, social dialogue. Anybody who knows the history of the trade union movement knows that it's a European construct based on class partnership between employers, governments, and unions. So we had this situation where leaders of the international trade union movement would often feel very comfortable talking about social dialogue, very comfortable about asking for a seat at the table, but did not critique the neoliberal model of climate protection, which we call in TUED the privatize to decarbonize proposal. So all over the world we see think tanks, the IMF, the World Bank, saying that if we want to protect the climate, we have to create an enabling environment for the private sector. And what that means is a tax on public systems and particularly public energy companies. Now, in 2012, we were in Rio de Janeiro for Rio Plus 20, and I want to acknowledge Joshua Mata, who came to our meeting in New York, and also Fito Aguirre from CTA Argentina, and Achim Roy. We decided in Rio, there was a big trade union assembly, and we had to listen to representatives of the IMF, the ILO, and it was all the same. Seat at the table, just transition, sustainable growth. That was what was being put forward. And there was an uproar in the room, particularly from unions from the Global South, who said, this sounds like it's progressive, green and inclusive growth, But underneath it is a privatization agenda that we must resist with full force. Now, that then led to us to convene a meeting in October 2012. The three comrades who were in the room were there, who I mentioned, were there. And what we tried to say, and what we started with an analysis, and the analysis was this, that what we were seeing was not an inevitable transition, but a global expansion of the energy system whereby fossil fuels continue to grow. Yes, renewable energy grows, but most of this is being driven by demand for energy. And this chart, sorry, I'll send this out later, but you can see the bottom three colors there, red, green, and brown, are coal, oil, and gas. So you can see the renewables at the top, wind and solar, barely feature, and that's today's data. So we're not talking about an inevitable transition, we're talking about an energy expansion. Here's another way of pointing to wind and solar, those two colors there. That's final energy consumption. So this is part of our analysis, is that whatever policies you put together in the 1990s to say the private sector must lead on climate change and we must all go along with that agenda have been completely ineffective in terms of reaching climate targets. They have also been socially regressive policies. So we see whenever there's a pollution tax, for example, we see the cost passed on to workers. This is obviously the yellow vests in France, but this is also the fight against the withdrawal of subsidies for kerosene in Ecuador a few years ago. We can point to many such struggles like this, is because the workers know that they may pay 50 cents a litre extra for gasoline or for diesel, but it ends up in the atmosphere anyway, because all the companies do is pass the cost down to individuals, many of whom have no alternative forms of mobility, no public transport systems. So this is the socially regressive features. Now, we've done a good job, as TUED, I believe, in critiquing the neoliberal approaches. So I don't have time to read off this list, but we'll share it. This is everything that what they've succeeded in doing is using public money to guarantee private profit. What they've also succeeded in doing is to have high levels of climate ambition. But that doesn't mean very much. It's a press release. And thirdly, they basically have got the Paris Agreement. All countries signed it pretty much. That was an achievement, yes, but it was never going to reach its targets. Now, where does the public pathway narrative emerge? We knew that there was huge problems with the neoliberal model. We also knew that we are facing a civilizational crisis in climate change, and we needed a different approach, which we now call the public pathway. This is November 2017. It's a working paper on the investment crisis. And that made us understand more about the need for public financing, which is actually less expensive than trying to de-risk private investment into the green economy. Lower interest rates for public entities, many reasons we can go into. We've done a very in-depth analysis in this paper on how public financing is cheaper than, in the long term, than private financing. We also focused on the question of what role then do public energy companies, or for that matter, any energy supplier, what role do they have in a decarbonization agenda? And we came up with the idea, or we looked at modern, well-financed, well-resourced public utilities which handle most of the world's electricity, and we're talking about electricity mostly now, that agenda we talked about was called Reclaim and Restore. And we went into a lot of detail on what that would look like in terms of rebuilding public energy systems. Bear in mind, comrades, that most energy systems remain public, but they are now required to buy electricity generated from private producers at very high prices. So this was the neoliberal model, was not successful in privatizing the entire system, but it was successful in getting governments who were required to borrow money in order to, or needed money for other things, were told that they needed to open the door to the private sector. This was a publication in 2020 with Eskom, because Eskom is the public utility in South Africa, was announced in 2019 that it was going to be unbundled, broken up into pieces, which is a World Bank policy. Now, Irene mentioned earlier this morning that we felt that we knew we were getting a good angle on what needed to be done in terms of reviving the public systems. But what we didn't really know was, we knew there were big gaps in our own knowledge. So we convened a global task force and we worked for over a year to put together a major report from which this program emerged, the Trade Union Program for a Public Low Carbon Energy Future. And it talks, we don't have time to go into the details, but it talks about repeal of neoliberal laws. It talks about cancelling debt, particularly in the global. Those concepts in a moment. Now, this TUED South framing document went even further. It started to look more closely at the role of state-owned enterprises in the global south in particular. And they largely fall into two categories. One category is the ones in basically the least developed countries who don't have any money to do electrification, whether that be green electrification or brown electrification based on fossil fuels. They cannot put the transmission in place, which is the primary reason why there are 650 million people or so just in Africa who do not have electricity. So here we're talking about decarbonization and a continent where 50% of the population do not have electricity. So those public utilities are in a terrible state economically. They can't do their job. Secondly, the other state-owned enterprises, Europe, China, India, are doing very well in the global energy markets. They have economies of scale, they've got government backing, they've got a history of basically providing energy, and now they're multinational companies generating money for their host governments. We can point to China and others, and that is a huge thing. So the question then, if we're reclaiming energy to public ownership, what are we trying to do? And that leads to the whole question of demarketization of the public utilities and renationalization of public companies that have been privatized, where that has happened. Now, I'm trying to do a quick stock take here of the strengths and weaknesses of the public pathway so far. I would say that in the power sector, we've got a really good analysis and a lot of really important proposals. And those proposals are being taken up by unions and other social movements in terms of reclaiming energy to public ownership, demarketizing, decommodifying energy. We also have, I think, a very strong position on how to address energy poverty where it still exists. 1 billion people in total almost without electricity or reliable electricity. And this points right back to the whole the structural adjustment agenda of the World Bank in the 1990s. So we're pretty strong on that. We could still do a lot more. But there are other areas of the economy that need decarbonizing, that need to be reclaimed, if you like. And I would say that we've worked with the International Transport Workers Federation on their public transport campaign. We've done a good job, I think, together on that, and we'll hear more about that probably throughout the conference. But we still are struggling with this massive build-out of internal combustion engine cars and SUVs in particular. We have dilapidated public transport systems, and we also have the problems of electromobility based on private electric vehicles, which is all the rage in some countries, although it may not last forever. So we need to do more on, we're only moderate, we get a grade B-, I think, for that. Now, back to the reclaiming energy, in the power sector in particular, what has been privatized must be renationalized. We should never have privatized electricity in the first place. If electricity had not been privatized when it was, we would be in a much stronger position now to address the climate emergency than is currently the case, where you have to incentivize and mobilize the private investors who often will never respond unless they are guaranteed profits over a 30-year period called power purchase contracts. So that's something we have to put a stop to if we're going to address the rising emissions challenge. So an ownership shift is absolutely essential. But we also need a mandate shift, because there are many public companies who act like private corporations. Many of them act like private corporations by law. They have to act like private corporations. These were laws passed in the 90s that make you have to trade on the stock exchange. You have to have market principles. You have to have full cost recovery, where your costs of producing power must be recouped from customers. Very few public utilities have reached that goal, which means they go into more and more debt, and then the credit ratings agencies say, oh, you're just a dead animal. You know, you're a dinosaur. We're not putting any money into you. You're not lending you any money because you're part of the problem. So reversing marketization is going to be a huge challenge, but we have to face that challenge head on. Now, this chart I put together, it puts on the left, I'm not going to attempt to even go through this chart, so please relax, but it tries to put side by side public pathway, reclaim and restore proposals, contrast to the neoliberal approach. I'm not going to have time to deal with it, but we talked about money, how public financing, debt financing, bonds, that is going to be hugely important and less expensive. We know that the public utilities are off-takers, meaning they have to purchase power from independent power producers. Where those arrangements exist, we cancel the contracts with the independent power producers, and we go to a direct procurement model. All of this is discussed in the TUED papers. Now, we also know that there must be a reform agenda, because the laws that were put in place in the 90s, or the 80s for that matter, which made public companies try to emulate private companies, some succeeded, many did not, must be reversed. That's why we're so happy to see what has happened in this country with the, since 2018, the gradual dismantling of the neoliberal legal apparatus. And we'll hope we'll hear more about those details later. So this reform agenda is going to be crucial as a starting point, really. And again, I want to congratulate the comrades in Indonesia for getting the Constitutional Court to declare the privatization of the system as unconstitutional. Now, let's be honest. If we could point to 30 other examples, we'd all be disbanding this conference and going and having a drink somewhere. We're not. There aren't many governments who have said enough of this. They are often responding and reacting to very difficult circumstances, but it is definitely happening in a number of countries now. The governments are reclaiming their power sectors to public ownership. Now, going back to the scorecard, and I'll try to wrap this up very soon, we have not done a good enough job on the public pathway analysis and research in terms of our proposals on other areas. We assert global public goods. We say that emissions generated anywhere in the world, anywhere, is a danger to people everywhere. And emissions avoided anywhere in the world is of benefit to people everywhere. And that means we move in to the questions of then there needs to be a cooperative paradigm of technology sharing in particular, but also skills, knowledge, workers. This was the model that built electricity systems globally. That's how it worked. We saw, after the Russian Revolution, we saw Russian engineers go to China and build hydroelectric systems. We saw the global north even helping, all done on non-commercial basis. When World War II was ended in Europe, the electricity systems were in a terrible state. What did the utility companies do? They formed an alliance and said, let's share our knowledge, let's help each other. And that was the model of rebuilding after World War II. Of course, all of that came to an end with the neoliberal privatization. So energy cooperation, global public goods, these are conceptually powerful ideas, but they need to have programmatic content if they are going to gain traction in terms of building a different future. We are very weak on the question of energy conservation and efficiency. We know the studies say if we used energy more efficiently, we wouldn't have as much emissions. Thank you for that piece of wisdom. But how do we turn that? Because what the neoliberals say is that there is no viable market in energy conservation and efficiency. There is high-level tables at the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who says, you know what, we can't really get people to invest in insulating their buildings. We can't get companies to do that because it takes too long for them to recover the costs of that investment. This has to stop. It has to be a public goods, public program, models of efficiency and conservation. But we don't have any, really, programmatic ideas in terms of how to bring that about. We're very weak, comrades, on the question of export dependency, revenue dependency. We know we're in countries, Colombia, we were there last May, others, poorer countries who rely on the sale of coal, oil, and gas in order to get hard currency to provide even basic services. Of course, not all governments use that revenue in that way. They often put a lot of that in their pocket, but we have not really dealt with it in a very robust and consistent way. We also know that industrial energy use is growing. Residential use, even in the global south, is barely a third of total use. So we have countries like China and India, 60% or so of their energy is going to industrial development, exporting goods to the global north. Do we have an answer to that? No, it's a challenge we have to address. And then there's the question of the contested issues, even within our own movement. There are those who think nuclear power has a future, a very important future, as low-carbon energy in a spatially confined area. Others say, no, that's terrible. We need wind and solar will provide nearly all of our energy needs. I'm exaggerating the differences, but there is a very intense debate going on across the progressive movement about these questions, which is why we're putting on the table tomorrow this idea of technological pluralism. I won't go into it now. Brian Kamanzi has produced a paper on it. It was circulated to everybody. Please take a look and have a look and assess those arguments and prepare for the discussion. And lastly, I would say on governance and democracy, there's been a lot of criticism of state-owned enterprises, and a lot of people, including in the trade union movement, but less so, the environmental movement definitely have a distrust of state-owned companies. They say, oh, they are undemocratic, they don't listen to the people, and there are many of those accusations have some validity. But we're talking also, if you leave it to the private sector, are they going to sit down and make democratic decisions with communities? No, they're not, and we've seen that. So if we are going to have reclaimed energy companies back into public ownership, we do have to have systems of governance, and that is not an easy concept to turn into practice. More on that another time. So I would like to think that we could set up within this group little commissions to examine these weaknesses and try to work together over the next year or two to do the research, to produce some discussion documents so we can actually have those issues addressed. Last couple of slides, we see in China, there are many imperfections, but one thing you can't criticize China for is when it makes a decision, it acts on it. So you have a massive turning around of state-owned enterprises producing 45% of the world's new renewable energy last year is in China. And it's also, of course, the major technology suppliers for solar and increasingly in wind power, electric vehicles. That doesn't mean to say we have to emulate China, but we can point to the success of public companies in China in terms of implementing a very aggressive energy policy. And this is actually this is the credit ratings agency Fitch, who said, well, you know, we got a bit of a problem here. We have emissions keep going up, private sector's not investing. Maybe the state-owned enterprises have a future. So you see, even the neoliberal establishment are reaching these conclusions. My last slide, this is the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa, and a comrade there, National Union of Mine Workers, energy policy, a public pathway to a just transition. The public pathway is a work in progress. We try to think of it as a theory for here to there, with energy at the center of the transitional position. Now, I would urge comrades in closing to take a look at the paper that was circulated, A New International Energy Order. Because this afternoon we're going to be talking about the massive changes in the global political scene that are unfolding as we sit here. As it happens, there is a serious backtracking on climate commitments from the global north. How do we respond as a trade union movement? How does the global south respond? That's something we're going to talk at in the next sessions this afternoon. But one thing we know is that the world is not standing still. We have to develop our own knowledge, our capacities, and our commitment to really create the programmatic framework around which we can organize that offer workers real hope for a truly sustainable and future and a stable climate in the period ahead. So I'll stop there. Thank you, comrades. I think we're going to... I can't remember what we're doing next. We're going straight to... Oh, Brian.
Okay, comrades, we have about 40 minutes or so until lunchtime. So I think what we want to do now is we're going to have an opportunity just to discuss amongst ourselves a little bit, and we want to focus on two areas, okay? So the first part is what resonated with me about this explanation about public pathway, if anything, what resonated with you. The second part is what feels missing for me. So what am I not hearing in this explanation of what a pathway is that I feel needs to be captured or represented when we think about this, when I think about public pathway. This is important for me. So I hope, is that clear for everyone? Anyone, any question on that? One more time. So the two parts are what connects with me, what do I affirm about this analysis, this explanation about what public pathway is. The second part of it is what's missing for me, what am I not hearing that I'd like to see more of. So there are groups that have been put up on the screen. If you cannot see it from where you're standing, please feel free to come up and we can arrange ourselves in the room and we'll take lunch at 1:30. So over to you, comrades. Please stand up and find your groups. What? Okay, I'll call the first row from each group and you can maybe just stand in a different corner. Comrade Tanya? Okay. Comrade Stephen? You can find any arbitrary spot, yeah. Comrade Smitri? Yes? So these are, if you're in that group, go to that individual. Comrade Marina? Stand up. You can find any area and then people will congregate around you. If you could get up now, if that's possible.